Today, Donald Trump gave the world an insider trading tip. Just hours before pausing tariffs, Trump on Truth Social said, "This is a great time to buy." And hours after that post, Trump announced that there's a 90-day pause on tariffs. Across the board, we saw many different markets rallying, including Bitcoin. Now, going back to the S&P 500, where we bounced this week, today is right off of the 2022 highs. We have now flipped a macro resistance into a potential macro support. A lot of people have been comparing this dip to COVID, Trump, China, conflict. Just like COVID, US and China butting heads, then there's a quick resolution, a similar style pullback and recovery bounce. So we've pretty much regained half of the correction back on this weekly candle. That is for the S&P 500. Now, going back to Bitcoin, this is the monthly chart. Bitcoin just touched the 2024 highs as a support. This is the same style support bounce as the 2024 zone, where we had this resistance, the ETF approval/rejection zone, became the support in 2024. So what we have now is just a continued stair step. If we're going to hold that support level, Bitcoin is in the very long term still maintaining textbook uptrend structure. Previous resistance, new support. It's pretty basic and pretty straightforward. For the macro trend, this would be acceptable and this would signal possible continuation to the upside, after maybe chopping around for a bit. Now, I want to make it clear that we have a nice bounce today, Bitcoin, the S&P, but we also have a lot of conflict, a lot of changes taking place, the 90-day pause on tariffs. We're going to continue to see a lot of tensions, a lot of news that will shake up the market. So I expect this cycle to be less straightforward than most other cycles. I think it's going to be a trader's market. Tensions and conflict will heavily affect the price, where you're going to see a lot more volatility. In past decades, we saw really just straight line up after 2008 with a couple hiccups in between, but generally it was just a straight line up. Now I think we're going to see much more volatility. I think that the markets are just going to end up becoming much more volatile than they have been since, 2008 or this entire bull run. The world is a lot different. Things are changing. And usually when there's times of transformation and change, there's major volatility, a lot of uncertainty, but also tremendous opportunity for new innovation, investing in new innovations, major trading opportunities. So I would say over the next year, just be a lot more open-minded to the idea that things can take interesting twists and turns, and it may not be just a straight line up like COVID. But of course, we'll see what happens with the Fed. And looking at Bitcoin's weekly chart, you can see that the bears have begun losing momentum on the weekly MACD. December of last year, the bulls began losing momentum, and the bears regained momentum until now. We're starting to get a signal here. If we can close this weekly with this MACD signal, then it's looking pretty good. Likely signals a reversal. Just like this was a bearish reversal, this will likely turn into a bullish reversal. And Bitcoin's weekly RSI is extremely close to signaling one of my favorite signals, which is a weekly RSI breakout, when we break the weekly RSI downtrends. We've discussed this plenty of times on this channel. We had a failed breakout a couple months ago, right over here, but now we're coming up and we're in a very, very similar position to a lot of our previous weekly RSI breakouts. Now, if you look at the weekly RSI closely, you'll see that what we have right here along this 45 level appears to be a continuation pattern. Continuation patterns, usually what you get are very similar characteristics in the setup and the price and the indicators. And right now we have a very similar setup where we touch the 45 level and we're coming right up on the downtrend line, just like over here in September 2024, right here, just like over here in October of 2023, this type of continuation move. So it looks pretty likely to me. I mean, the S&P 500 rally this week, if you're not in denial, it is quite convincing. I'm not saying that we're just going to go up from here. Who knows what the news cycle is really going to look like. But what's important is that when the S&P provides upside, Bitcoin captures that upside directionally as much as possible. Because the correlation between S&P and Bitcoin is a directional correlation. It is not about percentages. Percentage gains, percentage losses do not define a correlation. The correlation is a directional correlation. If Bitcoin can take advantage of these bounces as much as possible, we can make a lot of progress, more progress than the S&P. Now, going back to the weekly RSI and the weekly MACD, it's a continuation pattern in the indicators. It's also previous resistance as new support. I mean, it looks actually pretty good from a long-term perspective. Just imagine that this chart is a random chart, a random stock chart, and it's the 15-minute time frame. If you were looking at a stock chart on the 15-minute and you saw this setup right here, what would you think, right? Sometimes it's good to pretend that you're not looking at the Bitcoin chart so you can look at it as objectively as possible. And if this was a 15-minute of another random asset, this would look like a pretty good entry zone. You may at least look to bounce up towards, a lower high or something, target that zone. Doing that type of a mental exercise is a good one to do because we all have such strong opinions about Bitcoin, and our viewpoint on the chart and the trends are clouded with all of this, noise and just all the things that we think about because it's the Bitcoin chart. We're not looking at it in a very objective way. And we will be watching this weekly RSI breakout potential very, very closely here on this channel. Bitcoin is not really that far away from potentially breaking out of the downtrend, getting a bullish pivot out of this zone. Since January, we've been in a downtrend and we're really close to pivoting and expanding upward according to, all those indicators. Now, because things are so different this cycle, I'm not going to expect this cycle to play out exactly like all the other cycles. I think it's kind of foolish to think that if, we're having all of this conflict, economic warfare, trade war, we may see a lot of differences in this cycle. But as of right now, I think the Bitcoin market has had a healthy retrace. 30% is standard for Bitcoin. No problem. We've seen that plenty of other cycles in the middle of a bull market. So taking it one trend at a time here, we're probably going to get a recovery bounce at the very least. At the very minimum, I'm looking for a recovery bounce up above 100K at the 786 fib from high to low. And from there, we'll see. Maybe we continue after that. Depends on what the global markets are doing. So that's it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed. Be sure to smash the like, subscribe to this channel. And for those of you that are interested in analyzing the historical markets during trade wars, I posted a new indicator that is really just plotting historic events called U.S. Historical Trade Wars. And if you go to the S&P 500 chart, you can actually go as far back as McKinley in 1890 or so, right? So I have events listed all across time so you can see how this really affects markets in the past. And I also just noticed that the S&P monthly chart looks wild right now. There's a really large wick, solid bounce, I'll say that. But anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you soon.